right, I made it. Thank you all for your patience very much. Let me share my screen here. Apologies for the little blip on the radar there. Yeah, I do think someone messed with my computer. Who knows? Let me go in presentation mode here, and we will get things kicked off. All right. Thank you all so much for sticking around, and apologies for the little technical difficulties we had there. So, hopefully I didn't just get my computer infected with all of the stuff I was just playing around with here, but let's go ahead and jump right into it. So this session is kind of interesting, right? Because like back when I initially submitted this abstract to B-Sides Calgary, it's a completely different talk because of how things kind of turned out with 2020 and this virus has really impacted the computer security industry as well. So it's kind of going to be a whole different thing than probably what you saw in the abstract. But that's just due to a lot of the changes we've seen in the attack landscape. So in general, what I want to just kick this off with is setting the stage for around cybercrime, because this has kind of been a main focus for us this year. And essentially, a kind of scary statistic is that cyber criminals cost the global economy $2.9 million every minute of last year. So all of 2019, 2.9 million every year. It's significantly more than that this year even. I don't know if you all have been following the news around some of the ransomware gangs, such as like R-Evil and the like. But they actually just recently had one of their members defect and actually talk about their operations. They were talking about, some of their attacks, they're making, $17 million a pop. And overall, they're estimated to have made $100 million, just that team, in a matter of months. So in total, when we're looking at this as a global business, essentially, it's costing the world $1.5 trillion last year. And this year, we estimate that this is coming out to be about double that. So a pretty significant problem, and kind of staggering the impact and just the wide reach that this has. So what I really want to focus on is something that we have been inundated with, all of us in the security industry, and that's these destructive attacks. Now, mostly we're talking about ransomware here, but there's also been nation state actors that are leveraging ransomware and repurposing it for destructive attacks. There's been attacks against databases, just such as wiping data and destroying data. And then just the integrity of data as well is now being questioned, especially here in the States. I imagine you all have been following the news about the election. So that's a cluster on top of the virus. So hopefully we get our act together so I can actually visit you all someday and actually leave the States at some point. But we'll see how that goes. But essentially, like here is just kind of like with these destructive attacks, what we're talking about is anything that affects the cognitive dimension. So how we perceive data, how we perceive the world, what the integrity of the information that we're looking at actually entails. And then also, that leads into the information dimension. So the data itself, the integrity of that data. But the real scary stuff is these attacks that have the kinetic impacts. So anything impacting the physical dimension and having real world tangible impacts. We've seen this in the past, with attacks such as NotPetya, taking out whole entire businesses on top of, not just their core business infrastructure, but also power grid attacks and things of that nature that are definitely very concerning. But the scariest one, the one I think we're all most commonly going to be impacted by, is ransomware. Just from our data set alone, from what we saw from 2019 to 2020, we saw a 900% increase in ransomware just in general across the board, across all of our agents, and essentially our global deployment. So this is something that has significantly picked up this year. And we think that's largely due to some of the changes I'll talk about that are happening in the underground kind of cybercrime industries. and how they've changed their business models to adapt, given that a lot of traditional crime has actually been forced to move online in much the same way that a lot of just legitimate businesses have. Now, when we look at who's mostly being impacted by ransomware, predominantly what we saw is energy and utilities, kind of the main industry vertical that's being targeted. And that's pretty concerning because looking at the impacts that could have, if this gets into the actual systems that are controlling infrastructure or able to, reach some of those utility kind of infrastructure, that's definitely sort of very concerning. Fortunately, a lot of that operates on segmented networks and is mostly separate from what actually has the tangible controls over these tooling. But still pretty concerning just to see the amount of these types of attacks we've seen targeting them specifically. And shortly after that, we have government, of course. And I imagine this year, when we look at 2020, it'll be a significant uptick here, just because we've seen this leverage and denial of service. In Georgia here, just about a month ago, there was a ransomware attack against a voter database where they encrypted the whole database. So, we've definitely seen this used for multiple purposes other than just for profit specifically. But manufacturing is also a prime target. And that's mostly because a lot of this is outdated infrastructure. So a lot of these systems are, designed to be remotely accessible, but they also are not often patched. They're often running very outdated software and hardware. And so that's why I believe we see such a significant focus on manufacturing specifically. And it goes down from there. But what I really wanted to touch on is some of the specific and more concerning aspects of ransomware itself. So with ransomware, we took a majority of ransomware samples that we saw across all of 2019, and we took all of the live ones that still had active C2 and things of that nature, and we dynamically detonated these within our lab environment. And we did this to specifically map out the MITRE techniques and tactics that are leveraged within the automated ransomware payloads themselves. And so what you're looking at here, these red dots are going to be the TIDs, and then the blue dots are different ransomware families and different ransomware variants. And so what was interesting here is just seeing the overlap in all of these techniques and kind of what they're leveraging in their automated payloads. Now, we're specifically looking at persistence techniques here. And as you can see, a lot of these different samples were leveraging even rootkit type of behaviors, modifying the master boot record, and trying to persist in the operating system. Even after these victims have restored the majority of their files, they're establishing persistence that's going to be out of band and separate from the actual ransomware payload itself. Oftentimes, they're just leveraging, signed binary proxy execution, living off the land binaries, and establishing scheduled tasks, leveraging the registry, modifying startup folder items, and then predominantly using hidden files and directories. Now, a lot of this is going to be to establish secondary and tertiary persistence and access back into these environments. So they're going to try and make sure they have multiple avenues to maintain this access and get back in, should you find out about their initial access or should you start quarantining their malware. And keep in mind, this is only the ransomware payloads themselves. We'll get into more detail about the actual actors and the groups behind these and some of their tactics in a few slides as well. But the next one I wanted to highlight is Credential Access. Just about every ransomware variant that we looked at is accessing credentials in one way or another. And this is predominantly going to be leveraged for privilege escalation or access to personal bank accounts, emails, other credentials to services that they can basically take and resell a lot of this information online. And most common, we see these targeting the browser. So if you have users who are storing their passwords, within Chrome, within Firefox, things of that nature directly, they're specifically a target of a lot of these payloads. And even more so with the credential stealers and banking Trojans. So kind of interesting to look at how ransomware is also leveraging the theft of some of these items as well, even outside the scope of just privilege escalation. But one of the other interesting things we saw was targeting of chat applications like Telegram was heavily targeted. Also looking for FTP, SSH, look for SCP or SSH keys or RSA keys, I should say, and essentially looking for anything they could leverage to pivot and move laterally and gain access to additional avenues within the organization. And a lot of that's going to be done through capturing input. So, monitoring the clipboard, doing key logging, and things of that nature. Now, when we look at the next stage of collection, this is something that a lot of ransomware families have fully automated, trying to move laterally through SMB and then just gather files and information and sort of start to encrypt this data. But some of these variants that we looked into were actually taking a lot of this information and packaging it up and exfiltrating it automatically, usually to a compromised website where it is then quickly moved out of that site to their main marketplace or command and control network or kind of whatever their end goal is for that information. So it's kind of an interesting thing to watch happen because a lot of this is just fully automated. Whereas now, when we look at kind of 2020 and how this has changed, a lot of this has shifted to the ransomware payloads being kind of more specifically just focused on the encryption and maybe lateral movement, with the manual kind of component of attackers actually moving through and mapping out the organization by hand. And a lot of that's done because they want to make sure they target the most high value data. They also want to understand the business of the organization so they can put a dollar value on this data that they're exfiltrating and posting for sale later, or just how they're going to decide to leak and choose to extort the victim of these attacks. But again, capturing the clipboard, monitoring keystrokes, and just general automated collection is going to be a large part of majority of ransomware families that you take a look at. So those are the three I kind of really wanted to dive a bit deeper on. But if we look at the whole MITRE ATT&CK framework, the thing that's always commonly associated with ransomware is just these impact sections, encrypting data, inhibiting system recovery, data destruction, stopping services, defacement, all those kind of things that we commonly associate with ransomware. What we found really interesting was all of these other components that ransomware is leveraging in their attacks. And predominantly defense evasion, as you can see, basically every single sample that we analyzed is leveraging defense evasion in one way or another. And this is typically just to subvert endpoint security software, get around network security software, basically make sure that their payloads are going to land and stick and they're not going to be easily removed. Now, of course, some of the more manual breaches that we've investigated, it's a lot of hands-on keyboard where they actually go in, elevate privileges, and then just simply disable the endpoint security tooling. That's one we're seeing extremely common now, especially, with Windows Defender and things of that nature, just completely shutting it off and then choosing to launch their malware. So, they're just trying to take kind of the easiest path possible because that initial system is usually the most important for these folks. Because then if they can move through SMB, they can move laterally pretty easily. From there, a lot of it just comes down to using built-in Windows commands in order to do encryption and the remaining components of their attack. But that really depends on the type of malware that you're looking at and what kind of their end goal is and who's behind it. But yeah, as you can see, multiple persistence mechanisms in use and discovery is big. They want to do as much automated discovery as possible so that they can go and, without much work, figure out where your target file shares are, if you have any databases that are open, if you have public websites that they may be able to lock up and use in terms of defacement and damaging your brand. Those are definitely going to be targets that they'll go after. But to get into kind of the details of what these groups actually do after they obtain this information has been something that we found rather interesting, and we've been trying to dig into a lot more recently. And so I want to dive into the actual underground economy. And what's interesting here, especially looking at, I want to say like the last like 24 months or so, we've seen really a shift in terms of the underground economy and the means at which they've been operating. And it's kind of led to what we're viewing as a sort of industrialization of this underground economy, where to the point of actually making this very easy for individuals to get in on this and involved in some of these activities without having much real technical skill required. And that's largely made possible through ransomware as a service and shared hosting, bulletproof hosting, especially, and then the initial access brokers, which I'll get into in a little bit here. But first, I want to touch on double extortion. So for years, we've been dealing with ransomware, essentially doing their general extortion practices with encrypting the networks and forcing a payment in order to get the data back. What's scary about that is a lot of folks will pay these ransoms, but they will have these residual components of the malware still within their environment. Especially within their backups. Some of the groups now, because backup solutions have progressed to a point where it's made it very difficult for a lot of these folks to actually turn a profit from extorting victims, they've taken the longer game approach where they will actually try and get their malware deployed and synced up to the backup servers so that when you do restore from backups, you're restoring their malware. And depending on how those solutions are configured, some of the environments we've seen where it's just standard, storing of backing up of files from user directories and stuff on a Windows server, those are going to be prime targets for these ransomware groups, and especially for backdooring those servers. The traditional way, or the most common way, I should say, that we see them doing this is just establishing a tertiary backdoor on these hosts. That's going to call back, maybe once a month or even longer than that. And it's mainly just their means of leaving a foot kind of in the door to prop it open so that they can get back in should you find out about their initial access vectors or their other backdoors that they already have kind of established throughout the network. But, in terms of these backups progressing to a point where a lot of people just were not paying these large ransoms that are being asked, they started moving into double extortion significantly. And it was really started with this one group called Maze that essentially is kind of credited with coining the double extortion technique. But essentially, what that is they take the organization's most sensitive files, they exfiltrate this data, and then they basically say, hey, you have to pay to decrypt your network, and you also have to pay for us to not go embarrass your company publicly and post this information online or sell this information or use this information, for other kind of nefarious purposes. And we've actually seen, it started out with kind of marketplaces being leveraged for this, where they would go to, XSS or exploit.in and some of those very common kind of crimeware marketplaces, and they would just post some of this data. But now it's progressed to a point where they're actually running full-fledged web servers that are this information openly. You can pretty easily go and comb through there and see which companies are impacted and download this information. And what I find most surprising is a majority do run on Onion or I2P, but there are quite a few that actually just run on the clear and don't really care about getting caught. It seems they're extremely brazen. And so, speaking of extremely brazen crimeware groups, Maze, I would say, is probably one of the top most brazen groups that's out there, or at least was until they just recently decided to cease their operations. But what you're looking at is their website. It's actually down now. They do have the Onion site is still up, but this is essentially what these double extortion sites look like. So Maze over here, they refer to their victims as their clients, and you can see each one of these is going to be a different company that has been extorted, and their information is posted here. So you can actually download this data. And usually what they'll do is they'll post teasers of this, and they'll show kind of previews of some of the data as proofs that they actually have this information. And then you can either purchase the full dump, or at some of them, they will just release this data at some point. Most commonly, this data will be posted in an encrypted format. And then at a later time, once they've finished negotiations with the victim, and if the victim has chosen not to pay them, then at that time they will release the decryption keys, so that you can actually gain access to this information. And they're extremely active. I would say just about every day, during the time of kind of their heyday, they were posting massive blog posts and news releases on their site. And a majority of them are actually multiple companies that they are releasing their data at a single time. So over here is a single blog post from the Maze team. And it's a real interesting component because Maze, they have their core group, but they also operate as a ransomware as a service. So the tricky thing there for us as researchers is this really muddies the water in terms of attribution. And it was evident by a lot of the misconstrued news that ended up out there about Maze and about their quote unquote partners. The media even referred to them as the Maze cartel at some point, and they were saying they had hundreds of members and stuff like that. And it was something like, before we started really digging into it, we were like, oh, wow, this is impressive. We actually kind of believed some of that stuff. But, I'll get to kind of their announcement in a little bit. But it's interesting to see, how much of this is just like, in terms of attribution, is just kind of pulled from thin air and made up in terms of what, bits and pieces people see from different evidence that's kind of scattered about. And I think that's largely due to the nature of how some of these groups operate, because a majority of core ransomware operators do have a ransomware as a service component. That's very much the same case with Ragnar Locker, another very prominent ransomware group. And the reason I put Maze and Ransomware and Ragnar Locker together is because it was rumored that they actually were partners. They had teamed up and that they were working together. But it turns out there was just a group that was leveraging the Maze ransomware and the similar tactics of Ragnar Locker, in terms of how they would deploy a virtual machine and then release the Maze ransomware from within that virtual machine in order to get past endpoint security tooling. And so a lot of these kind of mixtures of different data points that are coming from all these different angles, it really muddies the water and makes it difficult for any one actor to be pinned down for a lot of these attacks. Now, some of these other ones are definitely more segmented from each other, like Nephilim. They've been pretty much like, there's this one group, and they are this one group running this one double extortion site called Corporate Leaks. And so, it's just one of these things that we just kind of have to watch these evolve over time so that we can really fully understand the nature of these groups and how large they are and how wide reaching some of their attacks could potentially be. But, same sort of thing as what Maze and Ragnar Locker do. They just have their blog posts where they post information on their victims, essentially. And a lot of these sites are actually where they handle a lot of their communications as well. And so interesting thing about that, like if you're investigating a ransomware attack, definitely do not upload the text files that basically have the ransomware notes in them to VirusTotal, because that's something that we found very interesting because you can download all of these. And so if you go to a lot of these sites, you can actually look through and see the conversations that organizations are having with these ransomware groups. So that's a big thing. Like if you're investigating these or your company is hit by ransomware, definitely don't go upload those notes, because then folks like us will take a look at it to learn more about these groups. So, it exposes a lot about their operations in terms of just following up on how they do their negotiations and what they actually say when their victims are negotiating with them. Which brings me to REvil, probably one of the more well-known ransomware groups that's out there. And they run this website called the Happy Blog. And what I found real interesting about this one, the reason I chose this one in particular, is they actually give a little insight into how they run their operation. So up here, they actually mentioned that for over a month, the structure of the corporation's work, user services, and cloud data storage were examined. And 1 terabyte of confidential data was copied as a result. And it kind of lists that data. So that's getting into more of what we're actually seeing now with these ransomware groups. A lot of them are gaining initial access through targeting internet-facing infrastructure. Most commonly, I would say, is remote desktop protocol that's unsecured, doesn't have multi-factor enabled. They're using credentials that they've obtained from other breaches, especially if you have partnerships with organizations and you have shared access between organizations, like managed service providers are a big target for them, because they can use that access usually to gain access to adjacent organizations. And that's the big thing with a lot of this stolen data. Even though there's this gap in time before they post this information publicly, you have to understand that they are sharing this information within their inner circles and they're leveraging this data. They're getting their use out of it before any of it is published here and before they even often notify the customer and begin the encryption process. So there's kind of this whole cycle that's happening before these victims are even aware that they've had these attackers in their network for often a significant amount of time. Now, PISA, or Protect Your System Amigo, they also go by Mespinoza. And these guys have a pretty creative site. It looks kind of like an old Commodore 64 sort of terminal. And they actually give little advertisements for their victims here, and they refer to them as their partners. So kind of creative, but these guys are still assholes for sure. Clop, another pretty well-known ransomware gang. And what's interesting about their site, so, as you can see, there's a bunch of stuff kind of fuzzed out here. That's where you can communicate with them, and there's other companies that are listed. But essentially, they list down here that they've never attacked hospitals, orphanages, nursing homes, charitable foundations, and they will not go after these targets. So, it's kind of interesting to see some of these groups actually post information like this, whereas other groups are specifically saying, like, no, we are going to go after those types of organizations because we know they will pay. And that's something we're dealing with right now in terms of Ryuk. Now, Ryuk is not a double extortion group. They're not known to do the leaks and things like this, but they are known for moving incredibly fast through networks, often, matter of a couple hours to pivot and encrypt an entire organization. And they're one of the groups that they've kind of created some infighting within these ransomware gangs in terms of they're the ones that are like, no, we're just going to go after whoever. We don't care. They specifically targeted United Healthcare within the United States recently, and over the past couple weeks, they've specifically been targeting various hospitals across the United States. So it's kind of interesting to see some of these groups have some kind of standards, and then other groups just do not care at all. Doppelpamer, another double extortion group, posting their leaks online. Sekhmet is an interesting one. They were extremely prolific. I would say just about every day or two they're posting new victims on their site. And now this site has actually been taken down, and it's believed that they have switched names and kind of changed tactics quite a bit. So there's rumor that Grigor Ransomware is actually the new variant of Sekhmet. But same kind of thing. They both run these data leak sites and post this information online. And the interesting thing too with Sekhmet or Grigor is they also run on the ClearNet. So you don't have to use Tor, you don't have to use I2P or anything like that to gain access to their data leak sites. And I think that's part of the reason why they have so many hits. As you can see here, 28,000 views of this insurance organization's data set. So, these data breaches are wide-reaching and very publicly damaging to a lot of these organizations. Conti is a neat one. This is a special one for us because one of our threat researchers, Brian Baskin, actually was the first to discover this one and report on it. So he did the initial reversing and kind of hit the ground running with this one. And at the time, we didn't know this was a double extortion group. We thought this was just, traditional ransomware, just kind of taking some of Ryuk's components, because it was believed at the time it was the new variant of Ryuk. But interestingly enough, about a month after our write-up came out on this, we actually found Conti News, and they started posting double extortion information on their victims. Now, Suncrypt, very similar thing. They run their same sort of data extortion site. So nothing too interesting here. But oftentimes these ones that say like full dump, you can actually just download all of this data. So all of this is extremely useful for crimeware groups, because they can use this for all sorts of various purposes, which kind of brings us to looking at some of these Crimeware forums specifically. Now, this is where a lot of the smaller operators will post their information, usually across various Crimeware sites and hacker forums and things of that nature. So, if you're looking at like XSS or exploit.in or raid forums, which now is kind of probably, I would say, one of the most prominent ones because of some of the high profile breach data that's been posted there. A lot of these are going to be these smaller actors that are maybe using a ransomware as a service or something like that to kind of commit their crimes. And they're usually just a single individual that's kind of running with some of these attacks. Now, getting back into Maze, this is actually a couple days ago. I should have updated this. But on November 1st, they actually announced that they officially closed the Maze project. And it's funny, they actually call out how the media referred to them as the Maze Cartel, how it never existed, how they were not this massive group. But it really shows just kind of that problem with attribution. And us as an industry, we always want to have a name to put to things. We want to have someone to tie to these kind of nefarious things. But at the end of the day, oftentimes it is these small actors who manage to just create a service that's very useful to a lot of different people. So it seems much bigger than it is. But yeah, Maze Cartel has quote unquote officially ended their reign. And the funniest thing about this is they said they stopped due to the fact that they were just trying to prove organizations had vulnerabilities, essentially, which we all know is bullshit. They made millions off of these attacks, and I wonder if they just kind of got spooked, maybe hit some larger, more well funded companies, or larger companies with more well funded security teams, and maybe got spooked and decided to close out. But still real interesting to see kind of some of this news come out and the impacts that this can have. Now, getting back into how some of this information is used, credential stuffing is a significant component of these attacks. Almost all of the ransomware and just various other types of malware that we look at is going after sensitive credentials and exfiltrating this data. Now, this information is used to gain access to personal accounts, to other companies, and things of that nature. Oftentimes, if you have like a relationship with another company, one of the things we'll see them do is start leveraging conversation hijacking. And especially with Emotet recently, this has made a significant resurgence. But essentially what this is they will compromise Office 365 directly, especially orgs that don't have multi-factor configured. And then they will go through and find these historical conversations that you might have had with a different company where you have this trusted relationship already. And they simply start rekindling these conversations and ultimately send a payload, usually in the form of a macro-enabled document or something like that. But it's very believable. These incidents we've looked into, they look at the cadence of discussions. They look at, kind of your wording, how you talk and stuff like that. So it's not like these traditional phishing attacks we're used to. It's actually very targeted and something that, most people, I would say, could be tricked by some of these methods that they're using. Now, even more interesting, some organizations that have more detailed segmentation in place, making it very difficult to pivot directly between nodes, they've actually resorted to pivoting using things like Slack and inter-office chat technologies, which is super interesting to see. But leveraging that same sort of concept with email, but just doing it inter-office within a single organization. And I think part of the reason we've seen that so significantly now is because the wide move to remote working. So a lot of people just aren't connected to the VPNs. They might not have to be. A lot of their information can be accessed through the cloud now. So it makes that pivoting and moving laterally to get to some of their end goals a little more tricky. But it's definitely been interesting to watch this kind of evolve over this year. Now, some of the tools that are being leveraged, OpenBullet is one of the most commonly used credential stuffing tools that we're seeing. And it's pretty open. You can take any of these lists of credentials you've obtained either from some of these darknet sites or from breaches, and you can just load them into OpenBullet, and it will go essentially try these credentials across a myriad of personal and commercial websites. So that's the most common one. And this is from some data that one of our partners, Digital Shadows, just put together a report around. So if you want to get more information on that, definitely recommend checking out the report. But one of these I found most interesting was Centrumba, because it actually does image recognition for solving CAPTCHAs directly within the tool. So pretty neat to have that capability, although it only will do simple CAPTCHAs. It won't actually go do the more complicated, like Google reCAPTCHA and things of that nature. But still pretty interesting that they've kind of automated some of that capability, because that is pretty impressive capability to see just within general Crimeware tooling. Now, for those sites where you do have the more complicated CAPTCHAs to solve, some of these tools get around it by allowing integrations to CAPTCHA solving services, i.e. CAPTCHA outsourcing. And so some of these I've just listed here, although there's a lot more of these. But essentially what they do is they outsource the solving of these to people in other countries that sign up to just solve CAPTCHAs all day. And it costs, I'd say like around $20 to do like 200,000 CAPTCHAs. So very economically feasible for these groups, especially assuming that they can try, hundreds of thousands of credentials without having to do anything themselves. And they just come back and figure out what they got into. And oftentimes that's going to be bank accounts and other means for them to make additional money. So it's really a low cost and high return on investment sort of attack for these groups. Now that leads us into initial access brokers. These are the groups that their whole goal, and oftentimes it's just an individual that does this, but their whole goal is to gain initial access to an organization, exploit them from the perimeter, maybe phish them, however means they need to get into an organization, and then map them out from the inside, understanding, how many nodes they have, what their business is, like, how what their yearly revenue is. All of these kind of details that allow them to decide on a price for what they're going to sell this access into this organization for. What's interesting too is, like, depending on the actor, a lot of these we've seen go for just between like $1,000 and maybe $10,000 for just that initial access. And it's often going to be using a remote desktop protocol or SSH, or sometimes they'll actually deploy an implant and you can gain access that way through a C2 service that they have exposed. But it's not a new technique, although it's something that we've seen kind of really shift significantly this year and explode in popularity. This is one of the ones, like back in 2008 or so is when like we really trace this back to like being kind of a new sort of technique for individuals just compromising individual assets and using them as nodes for pivot points to move laterally and gain access to additional resources. But now it's shifted significantly towards targeting organizations and then just selling access to these organizations for the purpose of encrypting and ransomwaring their contents. Now, here's just an example of one of these posts. This is someone selling access to a government institution in the United States. So they don't give too many details here, It's one of these where you'd have to message this individual to find out more about kind of what they're selling here. But this just gives you an idea of kind of some of these posts and some of the information that they're selling in terms of these initial access brokers. As you can see, this one's going for almost $40,000 given the current price of Bitcoin. And they work through these escrows within these marketplaces as a means to kind of create a mutual trust for each party in a sort of very untrustworthy sort of ecosystem. Now, I want to highlight one of these for this individual who's actually been arrested for doing just this, operating as an initial access broker. This guy's name is Andrei Turchin of Kazakhstan, and he's probably better known by his alias FXMSP, or otherwise he went by the Invisible God on various sites. But his whole thing was just selling initial access. He would do the initial exploitation, gain access, and then resell access to these orgs. And it's funny, it wasn't anything complicated or anything like that, just RDP scanning and password sprays, and then pivoting and backdooring backup solutions. And he was able to impact 135 companies across 44 different countries in the time he was active, which was between 2017 and earlier this year. And he was estimated to have made about $1.5 million just by being an initial access broker. And the main reason I think he was caught was he went after antivirus vendors. He is the guy who is known for compromising 3 prominent antivirus vendors, and he was selling direct access to their organizations and their source code for around $300,000. And he did sell that to some individuals successfully. So real interesting actor, but it does show this is a very profitable venue for a lot of these individuals. Now, getting into the marketplaces, this is essentially where a majority of these folks are going to operate, especially the initial access brokers. But there's also some that are specifically focused on only providing initial access. And that's mostly going to be focused on individual nodes that are compromised. So you're looking at more home user systems. So getting back to kind of the traditional means of compromising systems for use as a proxy, as opposed to compromising organizations for use in deploying ransomware and espionage and things of that nature. But the commonality between all of these is it really comes down to either reputation or your ability to pay. So if you're willing to throw down a couple $100s, you can gain access to just about any of these marketplaces. Though the real kind of interesting ones are often only based on reputation. So it takes a significant amount of time to get into some of these. But this is one I found real interesting. This one's called the Russian market. As you can see here, here's their sweet little logo and their login page. But once you gain access to this, it's mostly a initial access kind of marketplace, just specifically for personal devices. But over here, you can see like they're listing them out by the country. They have the state and city, and then they have the details of the operating system. They list whether you have admin access to the host or if this is just going to be like, some other user or guest access or something. But they're very cheap. So if you wanted just a cheap little Windows box to hop on and then pivot through for additional attacks, I mean, they're going for around $5 a pop. Now they're also selling SSH access, which goes for about $2. Then they have Stealer logs, which are real interesting. These are compromised websites they exfiltrate the logs from. So you can do a lot of interesting stuff with those logs. Sometimes these are even network logs from a corporation. They'll often contain session tokens, just general user information, oftentimes usernames and passwords, depending on the type of logs. And it'll often tell you before you go in to purchase any of these as well. But they also sell PayPal accounts, and they have credit card dumps as well. So all the kind of standard stuff. But for any good crimeware market, there has to be customers, right? So what's interesting is this guy, Amadeus Mozart, I guess, they posted this advertisement on one of these Crimeware forums, and I was just surprised at the marketing quality that went into this thing. So it's actually a very nice little flyer advertising for just what we were talking about. They want to buy RDP access into organizations so that they can deploy ransomware, and that's their whole thing. And if we scroll down, they even highlight the different price points based on the different geographies that they're targeting. So just kind of really interesting to look at kind of how some of these crimeware markets operate, and what that there's these actual stores that are selling this type of information, and there's quite a few purchasers of this data. If you start poking around some of these marketplaces, you'll see there's tons of posts going around just around this topic. I mean, initial access brokerage, I would say, is one of the top most active kind of posts that we see on these Crimeware forums today. It's just every single day there's new organizations being posted for sale every single day. Now, the last thing I want to touch on is just the money laundering component of this. For these criminals to be successful and for them to actually be able to make money off of this, they have to convert their coins, and they have to heavily rely on privacy coins. So majority of like crypto miners that you'll see, and also just the general tumbling that happens after this money needs to be cleaned, is going to be using Monero. Now, there are some rumors that have come out recently that companies such as Chainalysis can actually trace through Monero and can actually, put the end-to-end transactions basically on a map, so to speak. So, that I think is going to really change things for a lot of these crimeware operators, and it really is going to change things for law enforcement as well. Because if that's true, imagine what could happen if they decide to go back in time and look at all these previous transactions that have happened. So once those rumors came out, we saw a significant shift towards Haven protocol. And so that's a significant one that we see ransomware actors leveraging right now. And it is very similar to Monero, but it's one that they believe cannot be as easily traced. But the big thing is for these actors to actually make real world profits from this, they have to pass these coins through an exchange of some kind and convert them to fiat currency, whatever their local currency is. And that's the point where, often law enforcement will actually be able to tie some of these transactions to the individual, and it becomes a point at which these guys have more potential of being caught. So a lot of these groups that we're following oftentimes just have massive cryptocurrency wallets, but they often leave a lot of that money in and just continue amassing it until the point where they want to essentially disappear. And so that's what we think happened with the Maze group, is they actually got to that point where they made enough money. Now they're trying to get out of the game. But overall, the last point I want to make here is just the fact that all of these kind of components that we kind of sped through, because there's so much more we could really talk about in this regard. But all of these different components make it very easy for someone who doesn't necessarily have the technical skill to pull off some of these attacks to get involved in this and actually commit some pretty significant and devastatingly impactful attacks without really knowing what they're doing. So we took some general prices, so just like averaging these out across what we saw across all of these markets. It'd be very easy to go out and say, purchase initial access to a mid-size organization, then rent a ransomware as a service. So on average, these go for about $5,000 in cryptocurrency. And then, all you have to do is go log in and drop the ransomware payload and let it do its thing. And then just handle the kind of communications and talking with them after the fact to negotiate payment. But really, you can make a significant amount of money with little initial investment. So that's why I think we've seen such a significant shift to these industries because these markets are exploding rapidly. And it's scary for us because it not only muddies attribution, makes that very difficult, but it makes it so literally anybody can get in on this and actually become extremely profitable and cause some very significant damage. And so with that, thank you all very much, and appreciate you all sticking with me through those technical issues earlier on. My apologies for that. I don't know how to computer. otherwise, I'll be around in the chat all afternoon. So if you all have any questions or anything like that, feel free to reach out. And hopefully next time we can do this in person. So thank you very much.